Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. We are still waiting for a few minutes for a few more people to join, and then we'll be starting shortly. Thank you for everybody joining us today. We are still waiting a little bit for a few more people to join us. I think we'll be starting in about a few minutes.
Welcome, everyone. I think we're going to start slowly so that people can join. So we are most happy to welcome you to this webinar prepared by Groupe together with Local to Global Protection. So we'll be three panelists, Justin Corbett, Niels Carstensen, and I, Véronique de Geoffroy, and with the technical support from Paola. Maybe Paola, you can just give some explanation about the technicalities of this webinar.
Yes, so hello everybody. So welcome and thank you for joining us. So this webinar will be held in English only. So if you'd like, you can activate your subtitles by clicking on the caption button at the bottom right of your screen. And very important, you have to choose your language as English so you can see the subtitles correctly. The session will start with a presentation lasting about an hour, followed by a 30-minute Q&A session. For the questions, it's very important that you please post them in the Q&A section and not in the chat so we can monitor them correctly. If there are any major clarifications, questions, we will try to address them during the presentations. Otherwise, we'll wait for them for the last 30 minutes for the Q&A section. So as you can see that your high number of participants, we chose to mute everybody. So yeah, the questions have to be written in the Q&A section, please. And also we will be recording this session and it will be posted in the Groupe Ready's website and you will get notified once it's posted. And finally, we'll also be sharing the PowerPoints at the end of the sessions. So thanks to everybody and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Paula. So before starting, we'll present ourselves. So I will start presenting myself. I am Véronique de Geoffroy. I am the Executive Director of Groupe, which is an independent think tank specialized on crisis situation. And I'm the co-director of a project on mutual aid in times of crisis that I will be presenting later on. And I have the pleasure to be presenting this webinar together with Niels and Justin, who will now present themselves. So Niels, can you take the floor for a short presentation?
Thank you very much, Veronique, and thank you for inviting us to join you in this webinar. My name is Niels Carstensen. I'm basically a journalist who went wrong many years ago. So now more of a documentarist, researcher, aid worker, working for local to global protection, but also advising Dan Church Aid. Justin?
I suppose, Niels, thank you for that. And thank you, Veronique. I would be a forester that went wrong about 35 years ago and got pulled into humanitarian aid and NGO work overseas. I'm also part of the local to global protection core team, and looking specifically at trying to learn how support for mutual aid activities can either work or not work in responding to crisis. I also wear a hat as a donor with a philanthropic foundation called Legatum Foundation, who are also invested in supporting this sort of work. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So let's start this webinar with a few words of introduction and definitions. As we will develop later in the discussion, mutual aid and community-led responses are nothing new. But there is a growing interest about it, and the challenge is to better understand the mechanisms that drive mutual aid, as well as their possible interactions with mainstream humanitarian aid. So this is, I would say, the aim of this webinar is to discuss about how humanitarian aid mainstream can support mutual aid or not, maybe. This will be something we will discuss later on. But before we enter in these discussions, could you, Niels, could you define what mutual aid and community-led responses means, in fact?
Yeah, and maybe if you can move us on to the next slide. So these are, what should we call them? Working definitions between us here for this presentation. This is roughly how we'll try to use it, because there are no really sort of academically sort of well-defined definitions or separations of these terms. So they are all being used a little bit interchangeable, but for this purpose, we suggest that when we say mutual aid, what we mean is really the spontaneous and voluntary action of individuals, of families, and group, all in order to help each other in the face of a crisis. And importantly, mutual aid here is understood as what happens based on people's own resources and their own networks. Community-led responses is often used a little bit interchangeable with mutual aid, but we'd try to here sort of see it more to describe responses which are led by groups, individuals, affected individuals, people, but with a degree of involvement of external support and resources. That could, for instance, be from national NGOs, CBOs, international NGOs, or donors. And then supporting community-led responses is a particular approach. It's one way of working, and we'll get more into that a little bit later on, but it's one way of working in support of mutual aid or building on mutual aid. So SCLR aims to strengthen a group, a community group's capacity to respond to crisis, as well as reducing vulnerability in also towards future crisis. So this is sort of roughly how we will use these terms.
Great. And as Veronica said, we'll split this webinar up into 3 sections. The first, what we're doing now, is exploring what we mean by mutual aid and the core mechanisms that help it to operate. And do we see any difference between that and what goes on with community-led responses? Secondly, we'll try and explore a bit more if humanitarian organizations can support it without stifling it or worse, killing it. And if they can, are we learning anything about how that is done in practice? And thirdly, we're going to try and keep as much time as possible for this. I think Paula said we'd do an hour on 1 and 2. We'll try and do it a bit quicker, because we'd really like to have some feedback from all of you and open up the discussion with plenty of questions and answers and debate. So that's the plan for this morning.
Okay, and as a mean to enter in the discussion, we wanted to present our project, the Mutual Aid in Crisis project, and then I will give the floor to Niels and Justin to present their project they are working on. So at Groupe we launched a project on mutual aid in crisis 1 year ago, and it's a 5-year project with operational research and dissemination activities. We are still in, well, let's say the end of the operational research phase, and about to launch 6 case studies reports. So as you can see on the slide, there are case studies from Australia, from Chad, from Ukraine, and from France, in La Réunion, in southeast of France, where in the La Roya Valley, and one in Briançon, where migrants are passing the frontier between Italy and France. And in each of these different contexts, we have been documenting, studying what takes place without external support in terms of mutual aid in different kind of crises from different countries, from the global north and global south, in order to better understand what drives mutual aid, what form it takes, what are the constraints or the limitation of mutual aid, what are the factors that support or hinder mutual aid processes. So and then we will disseminate this result of our research, both for individuals, let's say community level or citizen level organizations, and for more institutionalized aid actors, being humanitarian actors, but also other kind of actors working on disaster management. So there's a disaster management agencies of different countries. And we are trying also to adapt this learning for our own territory in France, but also to share it more globally. But the idea is also to facilitate and strengthen mutual learning, I would say, from different countries in horizontal peer-to-peer learning from different contexts. The final aim of this project is to strengthen mutual aid and self-organization among disaster victims before help arrives, and improve links with the first line of assistance and between external actors to to the territory impacted by a disaster, and the local organization. And this project come from a series of evaluation we've done in the last years. For example, in Lebanon, after the blast in Beirut, or in Ukraine, or in different countries where there are refugees and host communities. And at Groupe we have been working on those situations for 30 years now. And every time when we arrive for the first evaluation, people say, you know, there was so much activities, there was so many community-led responses and mutual aid, but this has gone, and it was not documented. And then with time, this is this kind of first time of response and mutual aid tend to disappear or weaken, as we will see later on. And it's very rare to document these first responders at a local level. So this is where the idea of this project came from, and also mainly. For you to know, there is a series of 6 webinars to come. The first one is later on this week about mental health and psychosocial support in times of crisis, and the interlinks with mutual aid. Then we will do a webinar with our partner YECA in Spain about Valencia, following the floods of last year, to hear about mutual aid and volunteers coming to help people in Valencia. We are organizing also a webinar on mutual aid in Sudan with different partners, and trying to have a look from local, diaspora, and international initiatives. We will have a webinar on public policies for citizen involvement in crisis preparedness and management, somewhere in May. Then we will organize a webinar on Japan, from risk culture to the heritage of Fukushima, because there is a long history of volunteers working in Japan at community level, and they have been learning through the different crises. So this is really interesting. And then we will have a webinar on gender and mutual aid, to better understand how the gender issue is tackled in crisis situation. This will be in June. So we are organizing these webinars in partnership with different organizations, including Action contre la faim, research institutions from various countries, and we will be happy to welcome you if you are interested. And there is a link in our website if you want more information. And as Paula said, we will share with you this PDF at the end of the presentation, so you can go back to this information. Over to you, Niels.
Thank you very much, Veronique. And I just want to give you a very quick sort of rundown of a few of the things that we have done in local to global protection over the years that relates to mutual aid, to community-led responses. And maybe just frame it by saying, when we started out in around 2009, we actually started out in a sense in that realizing, some of us who began to work together, colleagues in national NGOs, small CBOs or international NGOs, that we in a sense we're just beginning to realize already, I mean, that was still late in the day, but then that there was a lot of things happening, what Veronique also referred to, outside our field of vision, that people themselves were trying to cope with crisis and respond to crisis, reach out for help, reach out with help to others, but that we as the 8 enterprise, the aid industry, whatever we want to call ourselves, we're pretty blind to it. But it was like this anecdotal observations were just beginning to sort of become too much for some of us to continue to ignore it. So we started Local to Global with basically with the objective to increase our understanding of and possible options for supporting what people were doing to survive, to protect themselves, and to try to recover. So those early studies where we looked at Sudan, South Sudan, we looked at Zimbabwe, at Palestine and Myanmar, among other, we brought together in what sort of, I think, the third or fourth piece of research together with ODI, with the Humanitarian Practice Network back in 2012. And when I look back at that now, I can see we were not using the term mutual aid, but actually a lot of our findings spoke to that. And I remember in particular one thing that really still stands out, and that was when we did the first piece of more in-depth research, working with Myanmar researchers in the border region between Myanmar and Thailand in the current areas. And when we were looking at the finding, basically we went out with a set of very basic questions, asking people what were the challenges they were facing, and what was happening, what were they doing to try to manage to meet some of these challenges. And when we went through, we were just about to finish writing, when we sort of looked and said, what's really most interesting here may not be what people are saying, but what they're not mentioning. Practically nobody mentioned assistance from the outside. And sometimes that really taught me something about looking out for what's not there when you do research, because that was possibly the most manifest finding of that study, because it did really not matter in the bigger picture. What really helped people through were much more what we would today refer to as mutual aid or community-led aid, some aid through national and local actors. So that kind of honed the rest of the sort of the shaping of what we've been doing in Local to Global. Then we're very much adding on this, well, if this is so important, is there a way of supporting it? So the rest of the papers that mentioned here, up to the latest ones on Sudan and Gaza, are a mix of trying to document what have people been doing themselves, what can we learn from just looking over their shoulders and shining a light on what we have up to now been blind to, and then very much on, are there ways that we actually can work in support of mutual aid, of community-led responses, without destroying it, without ruining the agency of people themselves. So that runs through all of these examples. And I think I'll just leave it at that. There's a link, you can find it on our website. And then just one thing, we couldn't get it in here, but it just came out last week, which I would really recommend people to look at. And that's a piece of research that Ground Truth Solution have just released on Sudan, with insights into a number of sort of the lived experience by people in Gedaref and in southern Darfur, which has some hugely interesting perspective there. And one of the things that struck me was, again, there you can see out of the data, out of the surveys they have done, that actually based on those surveys, it looks like more people have benefited from and taken part in mutual aid than aid coming through established aid actors, possibly even more than from for good reasons, much spoken about emergency response rooms and other sort of more formed of mutual aid group. But this mutual aid aspect has been hugely important also in the response in Sudan, and remains so very much today. But so we didn't have time to change all of the slides and put it in, but I would just say this piece of research by Ground Truth Solutions, along with what they've done earlier on Gaza, is also really a good place to dive in if you want to get more on that perspective. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so now we wanted to start with some elements coming from the literature review we've done and looking at research done by academics on mutual aid, because as we said earlier, this is something that always existed and has been studied for decades of research. So, and if we look at the literature, there is one researcher that started to speak about mutual aid, who is Kropotkin. I don't know if you've ever heard about him. He was a Russian naturalist and an anarchist philosopher. So I'm not sure that you've heard about him, but I'm sure you all know Darwin. And in fact, Kropotkin challenged the theories of Darwin by exploring the role of mutual aid in the animal kingdom and human societies. So he published a collection of anthropological essays in 1902, named Mutual Aid, a Factor of Evolution, describing how mutual aid has pragmatic advantages for the survival of human and animals, in particular in harsh conditions. His field of research was Siberia and northern Manchuria. And since then, decades of social science studies and disaster studies have documented personal and collective behavior in crisis situations. And now I will use a few results of a literature review done by Reiko Hasegawa from the Crisis Lab Sciences Po Paris, which I found really interesting because she proposed to dismantle myths around citizen behavior during crisis. And the first myth to be dismantled is that in a crisis situation, in fact, people don't panic. And social science research has long proven that panic is a rare phenomenon in crisis and disaster situation. And when it does occur, it is in very specific circumstances, notably when individuals feel trapped or collectively powerless. So on the contrary, in fact, people demonstrate self-control, adopting behavior that is entirely reasonable in the circumstances they are facing. So in short, it is important to stop talking about panic when talking about people in crisis situations. This is the first element. Second, citizens are active in disaster situation. There is another common myth, which is the idea that people are helpless and passive in situation of extreme stress. But research has shown that citizens get involved in relief and altruistic activities proactively during and after crisis. So authors speaks about convergence or altruistic communities to describe these reactions of solidarity between victims and unaffected citizens, which often manifest themselves in massive and spontaneous influx, as we have seen, for example, in Valencia during the last floods. So these spontaneous citizens' initiatives are often referred to as emerging groups because of the novelty of their tasks and structures and the absence of prior training and a lack of institutionalization. And these groups are made up of ordinary citizens, often victims themselves and volunteers from elsewhere, who spontaneously join in the search, rescue, and reconstruction operations. And these emerging groups play a crucial role, particularly when the authorities are overwhelmed by the scale of a disaster, or when first aid does not reach the scene quickly enough. This is exactly what we have seen, for example, in Beirut after the blast. It was really the citizens, people from the neighborhood that started to organize the first line of response. So they respond to the immediate needs of affected residents, or they deal with specific issues raised by the disaster that have not yet been addressed by the authorities, filling a gap and making the disaster response more effective. The third and last myth to be dismantled is that, in fact, deviant behavior is limited. Like panic, deviant behavior such as looting is rare in situation of crisis and disaster situation. And this is a problem because the media often report deviant behavior during disaster, as it was the case in the Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And this is actually survival behavior. And despite this empirical evidence, the myth of deviant behavior by populations in disaster situation persists, which can distort then the government response by giving too much attention to maintaining order and thereby diverting resources that should be dedicated as a priority for relief and victim assistance. So I found useful to start with those results coming from decades of research and academic research on mutual aid in times of disasters. So, Niels?
Yes, and let me just like follow up before we would like to just have a little sense of where you are on this and say another sort of similarity we're seeing here between what happens in across the world, really, whether we are here, or I'm sitting in Copenhagen, or you're sitting in Myanmar, or in El Fasher, in Sudan. There are still some commonalities, and as much as we as professional humanitarian aid workers have been really, really slow to understand and in a sense accept and begin to work with the potential of mutual aid, just even recognizing it. It seems a little bit from some of the literature that Veronique just highlighted, and from that study done by Reiko Hasegawa, that it's the same with official rescue workers and crisis managers in the global north, who again tend to sort of dismiss a little bit this work that citizens are engaging in themselves. It's unprofessional. They instead prefer to ignore it. This is very similar to at least how I perceive we have been looking at this when we are working under the sort of humanitarian crisis mode. But we're just a little bit curious to which extent there's a little poll coming up now. So would you just help us and humor us by letting us know to which extent did you know about this literature about mutual aid? Or is that, like us, something you only come to very recently, or maybe you're only coming to it today? Because for us, it's really been a journey. So we're just curious if you could humor us and fill out this little survey quickly, and let us know to which extent you were aware of research around mutual aid, which is quite abundant once you start looking for it, but has never really come into the curriculum at humanitarian crisis management courses, etc. Very rarely. So if we could have your quick response. And now I can't see the survey results, but maybe Paula will jump in and let us know.
Yes, so I'm still waiting on everybody to answer the survey, but for the moment it looks like most people didn't really know about the research. Most people answered a 3 or 4, and I'm still waiting on everybody to answer. But no, it looks like most people did not know about this research. It's definitely between a 1 and a 3 for most. And I will now end the survey. Thank you everybody for answering.
And then I think it's back to you, Veronique. Ah, there we have the survey. Yeah. So yeah, I think it just the survey kind of confirms the sense we all have of this being, when you look at its possible, likely, relative importance, it is quite astonishing that most of us have only come. I think I only began really use the term and get acquainted with the term mutual aid during COVID. And maybe that was because it struck close to my home. The little village where I spent most of the COVID time, I saw it playing out right, over across the street between neighbors, etc. So maybe it took the pandemic to open my eyes and to get curious and dig into this literature that was confirming what I was seeing, thousands and thousands of kilometers away, but took a long time to recognize. So maybe that is part of why we're, at least some of us now, are getting more, exploring what is mutual aid and to which extent can we support it. Back to you, Veronique, if I remember right.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so as we said earlier, now the challenge is how to work together and maybe support this mutual aid. So I wanted to share some concrete things that are put in place without external support, from the 6 case studies I presented earlier. So, for example, in Ukraine, so conflict zone, first line responder, there are volunteers groups that ensure evacuation, they give first aid, they do coordination and intermediation with municipal actors and services. They support food aid distribution, they organize the reception of displaced persons and accommodation. There are transport and organization of people on the move organized from volunteers, but they are also organizing the movement of animals and goods, pets. There is also the support to the army, the coordination and the communication of information through meeting, but social networks, of course, etc. What they don't do in Ukraine, for example, is cleaning because of explosives. And it seems that there is no real psychological care or care between neighbors, because this role is mainly played by institutional staff. In Chad, in the situation we studied, which is one neighbor of one specific place in N'Djamena in 2022, in the flood situation. So the people from the community, they organized the evacuation, the distribution of food, of sandbags, the reception of people, the consolidation of dikes, and they worked 7 days per week during 3 or up to 4 weeks to strengthen a dike that was um, 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 fragile and yeah, to protect the place from the flood. And then they did also communication advocacy, they did fundraising, and they found financial contributions through their own networks of people. They did also surveillance of houses to prevent looting, and then they organized themselves to access humanitarian aid. What they did not do is mutual aid at the time of resettlements and reconstruction. In Australia, facing floods and mega fires, community-led responses and mutual aid organized evacuation. They did accommodation, they shared equipment, repair, they did clearing up, rescue, protecting animals and property. They did firefighting lines, helping fire brigades. And then they organized mutual aid effort, and they organized the responses and did the coordination with institutional players. The same in La Réunion, where there is at a short-term clearing up places, sharing foods, food accommodation, etc. I can't give example from all the examples, but in the different places in France where we did the study, we find the same kind of responding during disasters, less after the disaster. And in some places, when the crises are recurring, there is some effort put in preparedness and learning from the disaster to get better prepared for the next one. But Niels and Justin, I know that you have complementary information coming from other contexts.
Right. I mean, looking at the research we have done basically since 2008 and 2009, it resonates a lot with what you just mentioned, Veronique. We see there's a lot of mutual aid, self-help, self-protection, whatever we want to call it, which focuses around what I would now hear sort of crowdsourcing of critical information, but also crowdsourcing of resources. So that I think is that's a couple of, it's an important term that I, as a humanitarian, have not very rarely come across, but this sort of understanding the power of crowdsourcing. Today, often using social media, etc., but it can also just be people talking to one another, but identifying. We saw a lot of that during COVID. It comes out very clearly from recent research and just documentation from Sudan and from Gaza. We see a lot of it being at a scale which we probably don't realize. I remember in Haiti learning when I came into Haiti in 2010 after the big earthquake, about a week after, and I've read all the reports coming in on the plane, as we do, and there was like 130 some people being rescued by international rescue workers. None of these SITREPs mentioned the thousands of people who were being helped and dug out by their neighbors, by their family members with teaspoons and fingernails. The same, the biggest relief operation in Haiti the first couple of weeks were actually the people who left Port-au-Prince, left Jacmel to go back to their villages or just go to the countryside and were taken in by families. We know from MIT tracking of mobile phones, 500,000 people were taken in and were fed for weeks and months. That beat anything we were able to do in those early weeks and months. And the same is very much true, comes through with almost all we hear from Sudan or from Gaza today. But Justin, do you want to take it from here and talk to some of the other points that we see coming through?
Very quickly, that there's quite encouraging sites of how mutual aid most of the cases I will give here are where mutual aid is being sensitively supported by national civil society actors, where we're seeing those kind of partnerships having impact on reducing conflict. So we can discuss in the plenary discussion more on this, but case studies from, again, Sudan, back in the Nuba Mountains conflict, the extraordinary work that was done with what we tended to call humanitarian peace building, where traditional community solidarity groups cross line between fighting Miseria and Nuba, actually managed to broker local non-violence agreements that probably had more impact with the cost of a few $1,000s worth of sugar and meeting mats and food for local mutual aid groups to broker the agreements than millions of dollars of food aid would have achieved. It allowed people to farm and to trade and to collect wild food. We've seen similar things happening in Amhara, where traditional mutual aid groups, the Ires and Ukubs and Idas in Amhara, for example, would pivot from their normal activities of funeral associations to rapid response conflict mitigation as youth were getting armed and violence between local tribes was being initiated. And they would, often without any external help at all, undertake conflict resolution. Interesting things now happening in northeast India, in some of the conflict areas in Manipur. We're seeing youth groups also in the Philippines, in Mindanao, solidarity groups through mutual aid who are addressing conflict. So lots to talk about there. In terms of addressing root causes, if I keep going, one of the things that we're interested in is the spontaneous mutual aid that comes out of rapid onset emergencies and crises that you see across the world without any interference from NGOs. Can that emergent mutual aid be helped to sustain itself to then start addressing root causes and reduce vulnerability? And there's some, again, encouraging signs of that happening, whether around survivors from the Myanmar Cyclone Nargis disaster in 2008, where groups that were purely looking at helping each other survive in the first 6 months came together and over a 3 or 4 year period eventually successfully lobbied local government to allow them to get access to fishing grounds, which the previous laws had prevented them using, and which was a main cause of the poverty that left them so vulnerable to cyclones that they couldn't afford radios or anything but the most flimsy of housing. Other examples of that around groups in Myanmar against, groups in Philippines responding to typhoons and now replanting mangroves along their flooded areas to protect them from future storms. We're seeing initiatives in Syria and especially up now in parts of the Northwest where mutual aid groups are looking at improving cross-community relationships. In Ethiopia, we saw mutual aid groups who were looking at trying to do something around usufruct, land ownership, again, which was a root cause of the environmental degradation, which people were recognizing was a cause of their vulnerability to crisis. I think a key aspect here that we're learning is that in so many countries, vulnerability and root causes of problems is related to local governance. And so much of the mutual aid that goes on in the end is political. It is looking at lobbying local governance, either to improve services or information or change local laws that are making people more vulnerable. back to you, Niels.
Okay, then let me just, I mean, we could go on for the next half hour, and we shouldn't, because we should make space for questions, etc. I just want to flag really two things. PL in the chat has commented on this sort of, is there panic in the first? There is panic. I think what we still struggle to understand that it is absolutely possible for human beings to be in a state of panic and yet act reasonable. If I'm thinking back Myanmar, Nargis, all the many accounts we got when we did the research afterwards of people climbing up in the trees to survive the tidal wave and the hurricane that night. But as they climbed down, they immediately began to sort of regroup, looked for their missing loved ones, at the same time began to salvage what could be salvaged. Was there a bit of eatable stuff? Was there some turpentine? Gathered together around the monasteries, began these symbols. So it's, yes, there's panic. Of course there's panic, but that doesn't mean that everything is only panic. We are capable of sort of being very quickly transformed into something which is rational. And then just on one thing we often hear from some colleagues who are cautious for good reasons, that are these community-led initiatives, are they truly inclusive? And I think there are good reasons to question whether everybody will be included, but then also be conscious of the fact that, for instance, in Turkey, in eastern Turkey, with the big earthquake there a couple of years ago, it was quite important to notice how LGBTQ plus networks within Turkey themselves mobilized and were able to reach people who could not be reached by anybody else, because some of the members of these networks didn't even dare go out, didn't dare approach official aid, not even humanitarian NGO-driven aid. So I just wanted to flag that I saw the same examples of the same with people of LGBTQ plus members fleeing from Sudan. I'd never heard of these networks, but they exist and they help each other find safer ways to cross into Egypt and be connected with individuals there who could help them on. So it's about, again, being able to look wider than what we usually do. Not to say that there's not issues around inclusion, etc. Sure, there is, but there is still in some of these case stories also some encouraging examples of people who would be seen as excluded or minorities, then self-mobilizing. And I think we move back to you, Veronique.
I mean, just of time, Niels,
Yeah.
that we can talk more in the group work, in the plenary discussion, but on advocacy and lobbying for change, apart from the examples of where mutual aid groups are advocating locally, of course, we're also seeing cases where mutual aid actors are coming together to advocate on a regional or international level. The ERRs are a great example of that, where they have invested quite a lot of time and effort in trying to help donors and international aid actors understand more about how their type of mutual aid works in Sudan. So similar things in Northeast India now happening, where in Assam, groups that have been working locally on solidarity between Dalit communities who face extraordinary lack of access to public services, etc., are advocating not only at national level, but now international level. But we can talk more on that in the discussion.
Thank you. Maybe short and quick, because we only have 5 minutes left for the plenary discussion. We are starting to analyze from our 6 case studies and with literature review, etc., what are the key factors affecting mutual aid? So if you have to keep one in mind, I would say the social cohesion within groups. I think that this is critical. Before and during crisis, mutual aid deploys within a group, feeling a shared destiny. And this can be then activated by adversity, such as a natural disaster or a common enemy, as we can see in Ukraine in case of a conflict. So this social cohesion in the group is strengthened, and mutual aid plays as a glue in this group to be able together to face the adversity. So this is really powerful. As we said earlier, if the crisis lasts, mutual aid can decrease or maybe transform itself in something else. And as Niels and Justine said, for example, after the emergency phase, there can be more political involvement to discuss and be part of discussion about how to rebuild. So engaging with more political discussion. Yeah, in those situations when where disasters are recurring, we see efforts to learn from the experience and to invest in preparedness, including investing in training, but also in having the tools, radio, etc. So there is this possibility to act before the crisis and before the disaster strike, to strengthen the capacity of the community to respond to the next crisis. So this is an entry point that can be interesting for us. For the key factor related to the external stakeholder, what really counts is the level of trust and the quality of the governance system, so that there can be interactions that are fruitful from community-led responses with local governments and external stakeholders. So the issue of trust is absolutely key in that. And yeah, and this for sure has to be built before crisis, ideally, but it can be sustained or weakened during crisis. This is something really, so the kind of communication and the information between the external stakeholders with the community is absolutely key to strengthen and protect the level of trust, because it can change very quickly and then affect the capacity of the community to really provide mutual aid. One example that in our case studies, which is interesting for that, is in the Alps, where the civil society is helping migrants, but against political and public policies. This interaction with other stakeholders is really difficult and not supporting at all mutual aid, even trying to weaken it. So we could go much further, but let's stop here at this stage. And Justine, I will let you the floor for the next slide.
Niels, were you going to say anything about this growing interest, or if we covered that?
I think we already, covered it. It is like our own learning curve, and we're just, yes, seeing that there is just so much more interest. Just the term mutual aid was absolutely unknown in the sort of humanitarian discourse just a few years ago, and now I won't say it's everywhere, but it's certainly something that more and more people are taking an active interest in. So yeah, did you want to talk to number
very quickly? I mean,
Yeah.
I think the key issue here is that in efforts to support mutual aid by mainstream humanitarian actors, there are very real risks of doing harm to the very thing that we are trying to strengthen. And that's a message I think that we feel very strongly about. We have seen it ourselves by making our own mistakes and doing damage, and by seeing others also falling into similar traps. And much of this is coming from the fact that mainstream aid operates in a way that is really at odds with this much more emergent organic approach that citizen-led mutual aid is based on. We've looked at a range of ways that those risks can be reduced, but a lot of this is about aid actors having to change the way they work if they want to support mutual aid. And kind of linked to that is this third point. When we go a bit deeper into that, we see some of this is related to kind of practical tools, the ways of working. And over the last 15 years, we have been slowly learning by working with an amazing group of national civil society actors around the world on developing a kind of toolkit that helps maximize chances of supporting mutual aid positively and minimize, but never completely eradicating, the risks of hurting it. So those practical tools, which we could discuss further, are crucial. But we kind of feel even more important is the shift in mindset that is needed, that allows us to open our eyes and see what has been there for generations, but was invisible to us because we did kind of think in the humanitarian sector that our own initiatives were so important that it blinded us from being a little bit more humble, perhaps, and seeing how important was the local response, that the victims of a crisis themselves are always the first responders. So we can look more at some of those mindset changes that we think are needed in the discussion. So go to the next slide.
Yeah, just a few words and images to conclude. I'm going to borrow this metaphor used by one of my colleagues, Pablo Servin, who is the co-director of our project. This was during a meeting with researchers and representatives of the French government about citizens' mobilization in the face of major risks. And he used this metaphor of mutual aid as a wild animal. So let me try to explain. I think that, yeah, it's because mutual aid is instinctive. Yeah, it's powerful, but it can't be commanded and controlled. So you have to learn about it, how it reacts, behaves, and adapt your behaviors to it and respect it. Because if you try to capture it or dominate it or coordinate it within your system, then it will escape or maybe even die. Yeah, it's something that we have to learn about, understand better, but don't try to include it in our systems and our ways of working. Yeah, some of mutual help groups won't accept to be coordinated by external stakeholders, or some of them will then stop what they are doing and let others do. Yeah. This was the first element. Now, Niels?
And then just, I mean, this is almost self-evident. there is none of us here who are trying to sort of put forward community-led responses, SLR or mutual aid as a silver bullet, particularly not in a time when humanitarian aid is in crisis and is increasingly, and probably even more so over the next year, is going to be on a desperate search for funding. Then please don't think of mutual aid or associated community-led crisis response tools as a cure-all, as a silver bullet. It has always, at least for those of us who've been working with it for now more than a decade, been seen as an important, sometimes crucial, complementary way of working, but not a substitute. And we still are working towards finding out how does it work best in tandem with other efforts. But we do have at times in the humanitarian business a tendency to jump to the next term, the next thing. That is probably the surest way of destroying community-led responses and mutual aid if we don't exercise the caution that that Veronique spoke about before and that Justin mentions before. Justin?
Yeah, and with all of those caveats, recognizing all those caveats, we think there are ways that mutual aid can be supported responsibly. But they do involve first and foremost this change in mindset, which then allows the organizations interested in this to look at their own internal management systems. And without that happening, we are worried that, yeah, we will continue to do damage to mutual aid if we try to just take it on as one extra little methodology alongside the other work we do. Does need a different way of thinking about engagement. And I'd say we'd pull out 3 or 4 key lessons for you on this. Just as in case this particular audience is dominated by international actors, almost all of the successful work we've seen on this is being done through national civil society, helping them learn new ways to support mutual aid. But being much closer to the local culture and ways of doing things, they have a better chance of doing this if supported to do so. Number 2 is to get over our issues around trust that Veronique raised right at the beginning, and compliance, and to start recognizing that supporting mutual aid in the correct way is less risky than mainstream aid in terms of issues of accountability and other aspects around quality control and inclusion and exclusion errors and safeguarding. So a third point we'd like to stress is that supporting mutual aid properly is difficult, and that it does need frontline staff who have got strong, participatory facilitation skills at community level. And we've seen an erosion of those skills over the last 20 years, I think, in the sector. So investing in frontline staff in those skills is kind of crucial. 2 last points. Whatever we do, we've got to make sure that we don't erode the sense of local ownership. As soon as mutual aid actors begin to think that this is something that we are trying to, in some ways, control or fit into our systems, that local ownership is lost, and then problems do start arising. So I think final point is that we should not try to co-opt it as a kind of cheap way of delivering what we want to deliver. It is not really a means to an end. It's better, I think, to look at it as an end in itself, that this natural compassion that Veronique has stressing there, the naturalness, this natural compassion that comes out of human beings in times of crisis is the end in itself. What can we do to nurture and cultivate and strengthen that without harming it. Thank you.
Hey, well, thank you very much. We are now going to have a Q&A session, so I will stop my share screen and look at if we have some questions. Please do not hesitate then to raise your questions or your thoughts, or if you want us to go back to one part of the discussion and give more examples, this kind of thing. So do not hesitate to share your questions. So we have one first question here about what does the research say about if and how the positive impacts of mutual aid on social cohesion are maintained in the long term during protracted crises as mutual aid networks tire. That's I don't know,
Yeah.
Niels and Justin, if you want.
No, just before that, there was one question before that, but I answered it in the chat, and that was a question from Vicky on about tools for managing mutual aid.
Okay.
Well, the term managing, I would question
Yes.
next to mutual aid, but if we translate that quickly into other tools for supporting mutual aid available, then I would say then have a look at the link we've sent in to our website, where there is a number of resources that you can dig into with some of the available experience on how to best work in support of mutual aid without destroying it. And then on Holly's question on the positive impact of mutual aid and maintained in long-term, I mean, we're still learning, obviously. I can think of community groups in the West Bank in Palestine, who by now are about 10 years old and still work. In some phases, they have had inputs, resources, including small cash grants from the outside, and others that's stopped after a couple of rounds, and these groups still exist. Some of them might go almost, and the same we've seen in the Nuba Mountains in Sudan, for instance. Some may go into sort of almost like sleeping mode at one point, and then you have a COVID crisis, and these groups sort of kick back in. And they have figured out the working modalities, they have a structure, they have a way of working together, and they have the links to, for instance, a national NGO, and thus a gateway is already established to begin to collaborate. So for some, they may just disappear when there's no need for them anymore. So Justin, did you want to speak to that as well?
Well, actually, no, I was going to jump in on Brian's question there. And we have put quite a lot of effort into trying to demonstrate why the issues of accountability when working with mutual aid can actually be stronger than some of the accountability we see in mainstream aid. And therefore, we really do look at, in terms of the tools that we're using, what are tools by which mutual aid actors can demonstrate that accountability in a way that doesn't interfere with their own ways of doing things. And yeah, we have some nice, I think some really nice stuff to look at that, which has encouraged large investments from mainstream donors over the last 2 or 3 years. I say large, it's still peanuts compared to where we want to get to, but probably around $40 million odd have gone in through mutual aid, just through the very small part that we're seeing with local to global and some of the philanthropy actors. And this accountability, Brian, is based on this concept of three-way accountability, that instead of just relying on the mainstream approach of upwardly finance management systems based on vouchers, which can, as we all know, so easily be cheated on. I can buy a voucher for $2,000 worth of cement for the price of a cup of tea in Beirut very easily, or anywhere else I'm working. So while still maintaining upward finance management control, we're now adding in downward accountability mechanisms through social and cultural peer group checking and horizontal systems within the mutual aid groups themselves. So we think there's a strong argument on that. In terms of monitoring and tracking, likewise, we've invested quite a lot of time to see how can impact monitoring and process monitoring be done in a way that doesn't interfere with local ways of doing things, and how we can start to capture that now on local databases, and even now looking at regional and global databases to build up quite an interesting body of data on what mutual aid initiatives are achieving, and what goes wrong and what goes right, and how money is spent and who's involved. So I think to that question, there's actually not a contradiction. It's just about this development of these tools.
Yeah, and if I can add to this discussion, I just wanted to remind that mutual aid can exist without any external support. Yeah, because in the first stage and in some specific context, it rely only on own resources, networks, etc. And then the support can be of different nature. It can be financial, but it can be other kind of support. And I remember I did a research in Poland about civil society welcoming the refugee from Ukraine in the first days and weeks. And for example, one thing that really support one of the organization was the peer learning from a Greek group of mutual aid coming and sharing their experiences. And this was valued very much from the Polish organization, a self-organized refugee organization. So yeah, just to complement, the kind of support can be of different nature. And again, and in some contexts, in some places, we see mutual aid without the need of external support because they rely on what they have already. Yeah.
Veronique, I see Reem's question there about looking at to what extent mutual aid can influence governance. And there would be a few examples, Reem, of where we're seeing some of that. Again, going back to Philippines, the national NGOs supporting mutual aid action there are looking very explicitly and openly how these processes of citizen-led planning and downward accountability to citizens can be taken on board through local government. And in a country where local government doesn't always have a perfect track record, let us say. And while by no means there yet, they're beginning to find some short, quick wins by picking out particular champions within government systems now who believe in this stuff and are now giving them the tools that we've talked about. And we are seeing in those municipalities processes by which local governance is changing in terms of how they are both involving people, citizens in planning processes and beginning to report back to them. We know in the case of Sudan, of course, there has been much discussion amongst mutual aid actors there about how the work that they're trying to do with a more, again, citizen-led public service response in terms of the emergency, how some of that can be taken forward for any new democratic structures that come up once the war is over. similar conversations going on with national actors and mutual aid actors in Myanmar, and with half of the country now kind of moving away from the control of the SAC forces and new emergent administrations coming in. They are proactively looking at working in that new space to see how principles of mutual aid could be incorporated into local governance. So some very interesting, very sensitive and low-key work going on, but yeah, I think very relevant question. Thank you, Reen.
Yeah, if I can. Yeah, sorry.
No, so
Please,
just wanted to add on that one, because I think this is where we see when we talk about community-led responses, II's activities led and implemented and done by communities, but supported from the outside. We do see many examples through the last 10 years of how this way of working, probably because one of the sort of the principles here is that resources are and decision making is vested with the community group. And that somehow also changes the power relationship between the community group, a community group, local authorities, and the local national NGO, even back to the international NGO that might be. And that in itself affects a kind of it's not a conference about democracy. It's really changing the interaction. By changing the power relationship a bit, you change the kind of the game plan, and that means that relationships gradually begin. And we've seen many examples, for instance, in Palestine, particularly pre-October 7th, both in Gaza with Hamas-led authorities and in the West Bank with PA-led authorities, how that relationship between a village, a community, and their local authorities changed radically, and the authorities actually became the biggest donor of the activities carried out by community groups. So it was not about replacing that authorities, but changing the relationship and getting them on board and realizing, well, here we actually have a group of people who are taking the initiatives. Well, we got the technicians. We may have some of the equipment that they need to fulfill their dream. And that miserable little $2,000 cash grant that came from an NGO will never make do, but we may have $8,000 worth of equipment, solar panels, and the technicians to put them up. So I think there's something there that we see in this way of working that then rubs off on the relationship and the power dynamics.
Yeah, well, thank you. I had another example on this political element in La Roya in southeast of France. I think both the disaster itself plus the mobilization, the citizen mobilization to respond to the situation prompt a political discussion when the question was about how to rebuild the valley and the bridges and the roads, etc. And this mobilization prompted or renewed the discussion about how to take into account climate change in our country and what kind of reconstruction we want. And this was a much more political discussion. And I think that this is exactly an example of what you were talking about. And yeah, so that was another point. We have another question from Hélène, who fully agree with all the points, but then she wonders what kind of interactions can international external actors have in regard to mutual aid without destroying it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, I might jump in, and actually, Helena, thanks for the question. It also links, I think, to Anita's great question after that. So I'll say a couple of words, and then others can jump in. But that first one, I think it does need a change in the way the role of international actors, and their role needs to become one more of enabling. It needs to become one of actually changing the so-called partnership agreements they have with national NGOs that kind of walk the talk about transfer of trust downwards. And we still see these kind of perverse incentives where people are talking the rhetoric of mutual aid and community-led, but all the systems we still use and all the terminology in our contracts and the compliance demands and the reporting requirements are all linked to a very different system. So I think there is plenty of creative effort in some international NGOs now to look at that. And I really support those efforts, but it's going to need a real change in the way international actors see their role with so-called national partners. And I do think, Anita, that this links to the point, your point about how we, what is the potential damage. I think the biggest damage we are seeing is where the international actors, because of a donor-led get money out of the door time frame, that they put pressure on national actors to get financial support out to mutual aid. We have a deadline and we have a time cutoff, and that's where the trouble starts. So we need systems that are much more adaptive and flexible to the rate at which things go on the ground. Luckily, we are learning quite a lot on how to manage that in a way that doesn't force national actors to have to increase their burn rate. If we get better at identifying mutual aid and learning, how to support it in the right way, a small national NGO can actually go to scale very quickly on this. And we have NGOs in various countries, which might be quite small, who through scaling out and training up other local partners are reaching beneficiaries in the millions and managing large grants, a few million a year just through mutual aid. So it can be done. It would take a longer discussion than we have now, though. But please get in touch after, because I think this is a really important point, the practicality of this. Thanks.
And maybe just to add to elaborate on Anita's question with just 3 minutes left, I think, and I mean, some of the concrete example we've seen is when the conditionalities from back donors or from international NGOs can be quite sometimes almost devastating. Some examples where they have insisted there should be some of the volunteers who were paid, so they became a little bit more volunteers than the other, and this is a pretty surefire way of instigating conflict within a group of people who have otherwise just stepped up and volunteered. The other conditionality could be that whatever the community decides, this actually can only be used for wash. And so, I mean, you can really trip and trick. And it's often then left to the national NGO and the community group to make all kinds of work around to still kind of get the money, but tweak it a little bit and work around these conditions and procedures. I mean, it's difficult enough. We don't need to make it more difficult. Then I'd say if you're a donor of that kind, an INGO of that kind, step back. Then you're probably doing everybody a bit of a favor. If you can't buy this sort of you surrender power and decision making, then you're probably in the wrong place.
Yeah, and just to finish with one last question and then conclude, the question was, can be seen as disaster preparedness. I think that indeed working before the crisis strikes on a community-based preparedness effort with giving some some concrete thing such as radio trainings, etc., can really support mutual aid. So it can be fully included, and maybe it could be easier, I would say, to work with time before the crisis happen through disaster preparedness effort at community level. Well, thank you very much, Justin and Niels. It has been a very interesting discussion. I hope everybody enjoyed. We will share the PowerPoint presentation with the contact details and more information and links for those who are interested. And we will also put on the website the records of this discussion. So thank you very much, and bye-bye. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a nice day,
Have a
morning,
nice day.
evening, wherever
Yeah.
you've been listening in from.